Welcoming guys, settle down, grab your heartbeat, share us round. Now tap that screen, tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it, it's your warm-up routine.
Libs has entered the grotto. Grump says it lives high. Grumps has entered the grotto.
Says, welcome gremlins to the game grotto. Take a seat, grab your daily hot, claim your points and prepare to play.
Welcome gremlins to the game
Gaga and Grumps has entered the grotto.
Gremlins to the game grotto. Welcoming guys, settle down, grab your heartbeat.
Chris Marvin has entered the grotto.
Now tap that screen, tap that screen, yeah, tap it, it's your warm-up routine. Game gremlins on the
Busbutter Momo has entered the grotto.
Game gremlins on the scene. Game gremlins on the scene.
Grump says at Busbutter Momo here.
Game gremlins on the scene.
Gaga Grumps says treasure box up if you need a coin for your daily heart.
Now tap that screen, tap it, tap that screen, yeah,
Grump says it's Chris Marvin high.
Game gremlins come and let's go. Now tap that screen, tap that screen, yeah, tap it. Let's see those team stickers flow. Game gremlins on the scene. Now tap that screen. Now tap
Grumps has entered the grotto. Grump says at Busbutter Momo here.
Gaga Grumps says treasure box up if you need a coin for your daily heart.
Gaga and Grumps has entered the grotto.
Gang gremlins on the scene.
Chris Marvin has entered the grotto.
Welcome gremlins.
Gaga Grumps says oh great like cam not showing again.
Samrat has entered the grotto.
Samrat says hi.
Settle down, grab your heartbeat, share us round. Now tap that screen.
Che has
tap
entered the
it,
grotto.
tap
Welcome
that
back.
screen, yeah, tap it, it's your warm-up routine.
Grump says at average underscore Jamie high.
Gang gremlins on the scene. Gang gremlins on the scene. Gang gremlins on the scene. Gang gremlins on the scene.
Gaga Grumps says welcome gremlins to the game grotto.
Now tap that
Take a
screen.
seat, grab your daily heart, claim your points and prepare to play.
Gang gremlins come and let's go.
Samrat says at Grumps here.
Tap that screen, yeah, tap it.
Che says like dull not moving eye.
Gang gremlins on the scene. Now tap that screen. Now tap that screen. Now tap that screen. Gang gremlins on the scene.
Gaga Grumps says him reset everything.
Che has entered the grotto.
Thanks for the follow!
Gaga grumps, says him reset everything.
Grumps has entered the grotto. Grumps says treasure box is open. Gaga and Grumps has entered the
Gaga
grotto.
grumps, says sorry for delay resting with the tech as USUA.
Che has entered the grotto. Chris Marvin has entered the grotto.
Oscar says you down good on a Wordle today.
Oscar has entered the grotto.
Gaga grumps, says give me some like, see it the leaderboard works.
Busbot Romano has entered the grotto.
Gaga grumps, says thanks, one down.
Grumps says ranking works again.
Gaga grumps, says the rest can wait, we have a leaderboard, that's all we need.
Grumps says at 67 high.
Gaga grumps, says let's play Wordle.
Poyu has entered the grotto.
Gaga grumps, says no, we don't avenue a wheel either, WTF.
PH7 says hello.
PH has entered the grotto.
If you would join us.
Grumps says would be too easy without a gremlin or two. Grumps says at PH7 hello there. Has entered the grotto.
Kansk GMT says nay.
Kansk Teamty says Jazzy.
Oscar says water.
Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
Grump says at Brocky High.
TH7 says lol.
Oscar says Zumba.
Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. Z.
Grump says Zorro.
Gaga Grumps says that's how today is going to go, isn't it? Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Like-a-thon, race to the top, like-a-thon, tap and don't stop, like-a-thon, who will be crowned, like-a-thon, gremlin renowned, like-a-thon, fingers on fire, like-a-thon.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Hearts be flying, like-a-thon,
Grump says at Bus Spotter and Malmo be safe.
Popstar says hi.
Reese says zebra.
FOFOSTAR has entered the grotto.
Fofastar says zebra.
Reese says zeros.
Paris has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says thanks for doing your daily heart PH7.
TGGL07 to 693005 says congrat.
Gaga Grumps says your word starting with Z, please Grumps.
Fofastar says zebra.
Grump says Zwati, failing the zebra.
Gaga Grumps says Jesus Swati you got.
TGGL has entered the grotto.
PH7 says holla the Polish currency.
Gaga Grumps says Agrino lives at number 3.
Fofastar says chaw. PH7 says achov.
Grump says Affirmo.
Gaga Grumps says Chorfits.
Grump says at FOFOSTAR welcome back.
PH7 says choir.
Gaga Grumps says very nice pick.
Fofastar says choir.
Gaga Grumps says choir for fireworks.
Grump says at PH7 gotta try some weird stuff now and then.
Fireworks for Gaga. It's a performance and explode 'em on her face. She's in a happy place.
Grumps says at Bonbon High.
Wordle within 3, so gifts explode with glee. Fireworks for
Gaga Grumps says fireworks for PH7 and Vocal.
as in her face they slappy. Fireworks for Gaga.
Good game.
Fireworks for Gaga. From a single rose
Good
to
game.
a whole bouquet.
Good game.
Anything will be
Good game.
okay. If you can
Good
dance,
game.
okay. Smileys in
Good
chat
game.
still win the day.
Good game.
Fireworks for Gaga.
Good game. Good game.
Fireworks for
Good
Gaga.
game.
Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid.
We would be honored if you would join us.
It's a LLL level up.
Gaga
Guessed
Grumps
it
says
wrong,
Grumps with the level up.
guessed it right. Now here we are, another height. If support was letters, you'd spell wow. This level's ours. Come out with me now. Green, green, look at that glow. Didn't solve Wordle solo though. Support came in, guess it snapped. Level unlocked. Shout out chat.
Gaga Grumps says welcome to our new level up song.
Streak still alive. Wordle solved and you helped me fry. Tomorrow we guess same time, same chat, same brilliant brains. Remember that.
Grumps says at Arlo Seymour High.
Chasers now need a level up emote.
Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says yes, I have a list of emotes. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Fofastar says equal. Fofastar says limb. Gaga Grumps says we are starting W lith A. Gaga Grumps says lol.
Fofastar says Libra.
Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Like a thong, race to the top. Like a thon, tap and don't stop. Like a thon, who will be crowned? Like a thon, gremlin renowned. Like a thon, fingers on fire. Like a thon,
The Jilvan Dikadit says Rose.
Fofastar says
The
lemon.
Jilvan Dikadits, closing parenthesis, has entered the grotto.
The Gilvan Digitus says Watsa.
Parker C7 says wanna have a date.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Parker C has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says your word starting with L please shy.
Grumps says at Parker_C_7 date is February 4th, 2026. Other dates are available.
Chase says for my usual wipeout lyric.
Gaga Grumps says lyric you got.
NUFC for LIFE says coned.
Gaga Grumps says nearly, a lonely yellow sea.
Chase says close but no tomato.
Grumps says failed at wipeout. NUFC life has entered the grotto. PH7 says comma.
Dev says champ.
Dev has entered the grotto.
Says cheap.
Gaga Grumps says coned fits and high NUFC.
NUFC for LIFE says hi.
Gaga Grumps says added a homeless E.
Grumps says at NUFC 4 life welcome back.
PH7 says eject.
NUFC for LIFE says peace.
Thanks for the follow.
Mad Maxon says hi.
NUFC for LIFE says peace.
Dev says exact.
Grumps says at Mad Max fan hi there.
Gaga Grumps says eject fits.
Mad Max fan
Gaga
has entered the
Grumps says
grotto.
thanks for following weather.
Weather says hi.
Grumps says at weather hi, you good?
NUFC for LIFE says peace.
NUFC
Weather has
for
entered the
LIFE
grotto.
says try peace.
Fofistar says space.
Gaga Grumps says we have 2 E's.
PH7 says peace.
NUFC for life says peace.
Gaga Grumps says peace fits.
Mad Maxon says at NUFC for life I love Newcastle, it's my team and
Gaga is in the box. Don't let her lose.
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat.
What's yours? Are you ready to play? Let those stickers fly. Which team are you on? Team Gaga, give it cheer. Team Grumps, are you here? Team Gaga, are you ready? Team Grumps, are you steady? Game Gremlins, let's go. Game Gremlins, let's go. Team Gaga, 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 Team Gaga, give it cheer. Team Grumps, are you here? Team Gaga, are you
Grumps says at Animal SNMK.
are you steady? Game Gremlins, let's go. Game Gremlins, let's go. Game Gremlins, let's go. Game Gremlins, let's go.
Gaga Grumps says doodle for Gaga. Share the like, chat the chat and shower her with roses and GGs. Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga Grumps says, are we ready to Wordle? Gaga Grumps says, what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A, D. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Like a thong, race to the top, like a thon. Tap and don't stop, like a thon. Who will be crowned like a thon? Gremlin renowned, like a thon. Fingers on fire, like a thon. Gremlins don't tire, like a thon. Hearts beat flying, like a thon. Gremlins defying.
Grumps says that Chris Marvin D is just a B without his belt.
Gaga Grumps says, I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance. Fofastar says dream.
Fofastar says dried.
Gaga Grumps says your word starting with D please PH7.
Fufferstar says devil.
PH7 says dogma.
Gaga Grumps says dogma you got.
It's a Wordle wipeout. No letters to shout.
Gaga Grumps says wipeouts in the chat.
Lost in the grid, can't figure it out. Oh no.
Sosna W. Kapchiak has entered the
PH7
grotto.
says 50.
Gaga Grumps says 2FS are blood. Gaga Grumps says T lives at number 4, I needs a new home. PH7 says spite. Gaga Grumps says spite works.
Grumps says sweet actually fits nicely.
Gaga Grumps says we end in ITE.
Grumps says or not.
Gaga Grumps says quite works.
Marcus Lister says where is Grumps?
Marcus Lester has entered the grotto. Grumps says at Marklester im literally here. Zami has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says in his rightful place by my side ha.
Zami says white.
PH7 says elite.
Grumps says at Zami welcome back.
Gaga Grumps says white fits high Zami.
PH7 says right.
Zami says right.
Gaga Grumps says only one thing it can be now. Gaga Grumps says took it to the wire but right in 6.
Good game.
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat.
Will the fireworks fly? A random star chosen by fate. Play a part, it's a live date. A Wordle with Gaga. A Wordle with Gaga. Ra-da-da. A Wordle with Gaga. Get it in 3. It's do or die. Only in 3. A pretty sky. A Wordle with Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says do you do the daily Wordle? I post mine on my page and would love you to share your results. Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid.
Good game. Good game. Good game. Good game. Good game.
Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says thanks for the GG's Marcus. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. K. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Like a thong, race to the top, like a thon, tap and don't stop, like a thon, who will be crowned like a thon, gremlin renowned like a thon, fingers on fire like a thon, gremlins don't tire like a thon, hearts be flying like a thon, gremlins defying.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Stella has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says your word starting with K, please, Zami.
Zami says kazoo.
Gaga Grumps says kazoo you got.
PH7 says Daisy.
Gaga Grumps says slowly adding back the tickfinity features. Gaga Grumps says Daisy fits. Gaga Grumps says no change.
Ma bai, tor bai equals 1 dao bai. Lie 868 Tarkas Daofu has entered the grotto.
PH7 says wafer.
Ma bai, tor bai equals 1 dao bai. Lie 868 Tarkas Daofu has entered the grotto.
Zami says water. Gaga Grumps says fold fits.
Elliot has entered the grotto.
Elliot says, why are you non-speaking?
PH7 says a word.
Stella says wafer.
Gaga Grumps says I am non-speaking. There is a pinned
Lacey
post on my
Evans has
page
entered the
explaining.
grotto.
Lacey Evans says paper.
Elliot says okay, thank you.
Zami says gamer.
Scarlett has entered the grotto.
Lacey Evans says paper.
Scarlett 1 for 4 for 8 says there's an F.
TH7 says wafer, wager, paver, pacer, paper, painter.
Lacey Evans says paper. Gaga Grumps says you're welcome.
Zombie says gamer.
Elliot says where's Grumps?
Zami says pager.
Scarlet 14,448 says paper.
Gaga Grumps says filter time.
Phoebe has entered the grotto.
Elliot says paper.
Grumps says at Elliot.
Scarlet 14448 says Peter
Panda has
picked
entered
a
the
peck
grotto.
of the Wordle is paper.
Zombie says pager is filler.
Gaga Grumps says he's right here.
Phoebe says gamer.
Lacey Evans says paper.
Stella says GVC and filler.
Zombie says graph as filler.
Stella says GVC and fill.
Panda says gamer.
Phoebe says gamer.
Elliot says at Grumps we need more of you on channels.
Gaga Grumps says need a consonant-heavy filter not using the greens.
TH7 says 10 double P is in play.
Scarlet 14448 says HWHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHHH
Grumps says at Elliot I'm saving bandwidth.
PH7 says champ is better.
Scarlet 14448 says it can be champ.
Lacey Evans says paper.
Lacey Evans says paper.
Elliot says taper.
Lacey Evans says paper.
PH7 says caper.
Grab your heartbeat, share it.
Stella says caper.
Tap that screen, tap it, tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it, tap it.
Gaga Grumps says excellent filter.
Gang gremlins on the scene.
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat.
Gang gremlins on the scene. Gang gremlins on the scene. Now tap that screen, tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it, tap it. Gang
Grumps says
gremlins
paper.
on the
Nice.
scene.
Now I want the pizza with
Now
some
tap
paper
that
on
screen,
top.
tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it, tap it. Let's see those team stickers flow. Gang gremlins on the scene.
Good game.
Now tap that screen.
Gaga Grumps says doo-doo to Gaga.
Now tap that
Share the
screen.
live, chat the chat and shower her with roses and GGs.
Now tap that screen. Gang gremlins on the scene.
Gaga Grumps says treasure box up if you need a coin for your daily heart. Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
Grumps says at Chris Marvin, get off my Q lawn.
Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. S. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Like a thong, race to the top, like a thon. Tap and don't stop, like a thon. Who will be crowned like a thon? Gremlin renowned, like a thon. Fingers on fire, like a thon. Gremlins don't tire, like a thon. Hearts beat
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with S please PH7.
PH7 says, I would like to play Snafu.
Gaga Grumps says snafu you got.
Norks Feuden
Nol
says Rosie
QXV
Q.
Buadem has entered the grotto. Grumps says at Novboom High.
Gaga Grumps says yellow A and you needing a home.
PH7 says value.
Grumps says treasure box is open.
Gaga Grumps says value fits. Gaga Grumps says no change.
Elliot says tumor.
Gaga Grumps says not sure tumor is a word but we'll give it a spin.
Elliot says oops.
Agnes Galloway has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says nope not valid.
M has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says you're missing the obvious lol.
Thanks for the follow.
Olibraz has entered the grotto.
Elliot says you have to be right with ID.
Elliot says asterisk audio.
Gaga Grumps says thanks for the follow, Ollie.
Fireworks for Gaga. It's a performance and explode 'em on her face. She's in a happy place. Fireworks
Gaga
for
Grumps says Wordle 3. Let's see those fireworks. Gifts and emojis will explode on Gaga's face.
Emojis make her happy, as in her face they slappy. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. From a single rose to a whole bouquet, anything will be okay. If you can, that's okay. Smileys in chat still win the day. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga.
Rosalind Humphrey NE has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid.
Grumps says at Rosalind Humphrey NE hi. Grumps says at Agnes Galloway 2 heya.
Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
Agnes Galloway to says it Grumps hey.
Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. A.
Elliot says apple.
Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Like a thong, race to the top, like a thon. Tap and don't stop, like a thon. Who will be crowned like a thon? Gremlin renowned like a thon.
Alfie Knox.
Alfie Knox has entered the grotto.
Gremlins don't tire like a thon.
Gaga Grumps says thanks for doing the daily heart, Rosalind and Elliot.
Gremlins define.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with a please Grumps.
Grumps says audio.
Gaga Grumps says audio you got. Gaga Grumps says a yellow D and I in need of new homes.
Elliot says drive.
Cocked has entered the grotto.
KD2363417 says Rocky Cool.
Elliot says drink.
Gaga Grumps says dry fits.
Grumps says at Susan High. Susan has entered the grotto.
Susan says hello.
Elliot says pride.
Gaga Grumps says nice we end in ride.
Agnes Galloway says pry.
Gaga Grumps says I only see two options, no need to filter. Gaga Grumps says pride is in the grid. Gaga Grumps says of course not those darn 50-50s.
Grumps says wrong P. Crystal has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says lol.
Good game.
It's playtime! Gaga is in the box! Don't let her lose!
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat.
Don't let him push yours! Are you ready to play?
Good game.
Those stickers fly! Which team are you on? Team Gaga, give a cheer. Team Grumps, are you here? Team Gaga, are you ready? Team Grumps, are you steady? Game! Gremlins,
Good game.
let's go! Game! Gremlins, let's go! Team Gaga, 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 Gaga. Team Gaga, give a cheer. Team Grumps,
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid.
Elliot says get 30k likes.
Gaga Grumps says awesome tapping guys. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. S. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Like-a-thon, race to the top, like-a-thon, tap and don't stop, like-a-thon, who will be crowned, like-a-thon, gremlin renowned, like-a-thon, fingers on fire, like-a-thon, gremlins don't tire, like-a-thon.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Gremlins define.
Elliot says I actually can't last the entire song.
Sophie says stump.
Sophie has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says your word starting with S please Chris. Gaga Grumps says me either Elliot lol. Gaga Grumps says thanks for following Sophie. Gaga Grumps says so now you got. Gaga Grumps says wheel chose the right starter.
Sophie says stale.
Agnes Galloway 2 says space. Gaga Grumps says stale fits.
Stank has entered the grotto.
Stank says hi.
PH7 says shake.
Sophie says spacker.
Agnes Galloway says space.
Gaga Grumps says we honed the A in number 3 and the E moved into 5.
Stank says shade.
Gaga Grumps says space still fits.
Fireworks for Gaga. It's a performance and explode 'em on her face. She's in a happy place. Fireworks for Gaga. Wordle within 3, so gifts explode with glee. Fireworks for Gaga. Emojis make her happy.
Gaga Grumps says fireworks for Agnes who have it in 2.
Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. From a single rose to a whole bouquet. Anything will be okay. If you can, that's okay. Smileys in chat still win the day. Fireworks for Gaga.
Grumps says it Maddie fine.
Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next bridge. Gaga Grumps says thanks for doing your daily heart, Crystal. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. U.
Stank says unite.
Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Sophie says until.
Like a thong, race to the top, like a thon. Tap and don't stop, like a thon. Who will be crowned like a thon? Gremlin renowned, like a thon. Fingers on fire, like a thon. Gremlins don't tire, like a thon. Hearts be flying, like a thon.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Millar has entered the grotto.
Millar says Unity.
Gaga says untie.
Gaga Grumps says hey there Millar. Gaga Grumps says hi Gurjaz.
Gurjaz says untie.
Gurjaz has entered the grotto. Gurjaz says it Gaga and Grumps hello.
Gaga Grumps says your word starting with U please Crystal.
Grumps says it Gurjaz Haya.
Crystal says under.
Grumps says it Millar
Dill
welcome
Pickle
back. Has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says under you got.
Gurjaz says onion.
Sophie says knock.
Crystal says snack.
Agnes Galloway says antic.
Crystal says never mind Noe.
Gaga Grumps says you really want to go double letter this early. Sophie says snail. Gaga Grumps says yes you did.
Fireworks for Gaga. It's a performance and explode 'em on her face. She's in a happy place. Fireworks for Gaga. Wordle within 3.
Gaga Grumps says fireworks for Gurjaz.
Emojis make her happy. As in her face they slappy. Fireworks for Gaga.
Gurjaz says at Gaga and Grumps too.
Fireworks for Gaga. From a single rose to a whole bouquet. Anything will be okay. If you can, that's okay. Smileys in chat still win the day.
Gaga Grumps says GG Brains. Let's see those W's in the chat.
Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga Grumps says treasure box up if you need a coin for your daily heart. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. L.
Sophie says later.
Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Sophie says lover.
Like a thong, race to the top, like a thon. Tap and don't stop, like a thon. Who will be crowned like a thon? Gremlin renowned, like a thon. Fingers on fire, like a thon. Gremlins don't tire, like a thon. Hearts be flying.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with L, please. PH7.
TH7 says Lanai.
Gaga Grumps says Lanai you got. PH7 says Alibu. Gaga Grumps says 2 yellow A's and an I in need of homes.
PH7 says avail.
Gaga Grumps says I can't be at the end. Gaga Grumps says avail fits. Gaga Grumps says we honed all 3.
Crystal says no. Oh.
Gaga Grumps says darn it.
Larissa Joy has entered the grotto.
Larissa Joy says await.
Gaga Grumps says I really need the peanuts emoji.
PH7 says await.
Gaga Grumps says await fits. Nice entrance, Larissa.
Fireworks for Gaga. It's a performance and explode 'em on her face. She's in a happy place.
Gaga Grumps says fireworks for Larissa.
Wordle within 3, so gifts explode with glee. Fireworks for Gaga. Emojis make her happy, as in her face they slappy. Fireworks for Gaga.
Larissa Joy says that Gaga and Grumps thank you.
Fireworks for Gaga. From a single rose to a whole bouquet, anything will be okay. If you can, that's okay. Smileys in chat still win the day. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle.
Libs has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A, D.
Larissa Joy says debit.
Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Like-a-thon, race to the top, like-a-thon, tap and don't stop, like-a-thon, who will be crowned, like-a-thon, gremlin renowned, like-a-thon, fingers on fire, like-a-thon, gremlins don't tire, like-a-thon, hearts be flying, like
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with D, please, Larissa. Larissa Joy says debit.
Tiffany has entered the
Gaga
grotto.
Grumps says debit you got.
Tiffany says hi.
Grumps says at Tiffany Heyer.
Gaga Grumps says yellow D and I in need of homes.
Larissa Joy says idiom.
Gaga Grumps says hey there, Tiffany. Gaga Grumps says idiom fits.
Grumps says treasure box is open.
Gaga grumps says no change.
Hairyball has entered the grotto.
Gaga grumps says valid don't fit I can't go there.
Crystal says biddy.
Larissa Joy says child.
Crystal says no, never mind.
Larissa Joyce says no.
Gaga grumps says biddy fits.
Crystal says no. Larissa Joy says windy. Crystal says no B.
Gaga grumps says I couldn't see it lol.
Larissa Joy says windy.
Crystal says windy.
Gaga grumps says I can't go there. Gaga grumps says windy fits.
Chiral Shoe has entered the grotto.
Gaga grumps says ID and Y have found homes.
Larissa Joy says giddy.
Gaga grumps says welcome back busbotter.
Crystal says zitty giddy.
Gaga grumps says giddy works.
Welcome, Gremlin, to the game grotto. Welcome,
Crystal says nice.
Gremlins, to the game grotto. Welcome in, guys. Settle
Gaga
down.
grumps says GG
Grab
gremlins.
your heartbeat.
Let's see those double
Share
hands
us
in the chat.
round. Now tap that screen, tap it, tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it, tap it. It's your warm-up routine. Game Gremlins on the scene. Game Gremlins on the scene. Game Gremlins on
TLR
the scene.
has entered the grotto.
TLR says diddy.
Game Gremlins on the scene.
Gaga grumps says do the do for Gaga.
Now
Share
tap
the
that
live,
screen.
chat the chat and
Tap it,
shower
tap
her with
it,
roses
tap
and
that screen, yeah,
GGs.
tap it, tap it. Game Gremlins, come and let's go. Now tap that screen.
TLR says
Tap
diddy.
it, tap it, tap that screen, yeah, tap it, tap it. Let's see those teams
Gaga
take it
grumps
slow.
says hey there TLR.
Game
DLR
Gremlins
says
on
yo.
the scene. Now tap that screen. Now tap that screen.
That says are you gonna do another one?
Now tap that screen.
Gaga grumps says treasure box up if you need a coin for your
Game
daily heart.
Gremlins on the scene.
Gaga grumps says if you haven't done it yet grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga grumps says let's play world.
Fleur says audio.
Shay says I'd rather play Wordle.
Gaga Grumps says I have a stream deck for the repetitive stuff busbutter. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
Grumps says F still.
Larissa Joy says frail.
Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A, D.
Paul says daily.
Gaga Grumps says save as you waiting for me to type everything out all the time. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Plus says daily.
Larissa Joyce says do better.
Race to the top like a thorn. Tap and don't stop like a thorn. Who will be crowned like a thorn? Gremlin renowned like a thorn. Fingers on fire like a thorn. Gremlins don't tire like a thorn. Hearts be flying like a thorn.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Unknown Girl says dating.
If you would join us.
Gaga Grumps says shy back in the house.
Says dwarf.
Unknown Girl has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says thanks for doing your daily heart TLR. TLR says do daily.
Bring It On has entered the grotto.
Says oi.
Gaga Grumps says your word starting with D please busbutter.
Fleur says you listening to me.
Gaga Grumps says it's busbutter's choice TLR.
Grumps says at TLR. Winner of the like race calls the first word.
Gaga Grumps says if your word is being filtered try, I'd like word. Gaga Grumps says dream you got. Gaga Grumps says a yellow R in need of a home. MMKH says churn.
Larissa Joy says flower.
Gaga Grumps says right fits. Gaga Grumps says I lives at number 2 Wordle Street. R and H need new homes.
Larissa Joy says birch.
Grumps says treasure box is open. Crystal says Birch XXX.
Gaga Grumps says Birch fits.
Fireworks for Gaga. It's a performance night. Explode 'em on her face. She's in a happy place. Fireworks for Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says Wordle in 3. Let's see those fireworks. Gifts and emojis will explode on Gaga's face.
Emojis make her happy.
Crystal says congrats, congrats, congrats.
Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. From a single rose to a whole
King Chaos has entered the grotto.
everything will be okay. If you care, that's okay. Smileys in chat still win the day. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Fireworks for Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says thanks for doing your daily heart, Larissa. Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid.
Larissa Joy says at Gaga and Grumps, welcome. It's my pleasure.
Gaga Grumps says who is ready to Wordle.
MMKH says wheel is F.
Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now. Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. C.
Mum says cruel.
Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Like a thumb, race to the top, like a thon. Tap and don't stop, like a thon. Who will be crowned like a thon? Gremlin renowned, like a thon. Fingers on fire, like a thon. Gremlins don't tire, like a thon.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Gremlins define.
Gaga Grumps says hi MMKH, didn't see you coming. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with C, please MMKH.
MMKH says cruel.
Gaga Grumps says cruel you
Thanks
got.
for the follow. It's a Wordle wipeout. No letters to shout.
Gaga Grumps says wipeouts in the chat.
SCRJ60787008 says thanks.
Says thanks.
Oh no. Wipeout.
Mum says stain is better.
Scray has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says thanks for following Bring It On. Gaga Grumps says stain fits. MMKH says Nash. Gaga Grumps says Alives at number 3S and N need new homes. Gaga Grumps says hey Charles, how you doing? Gaga Grumps says Nash fits.
Fireworks for Gaga. It's a performance and explode 'em on her face. She's in a happy place.
Gaga Grumps says fireworks for MMKH.
Wordle within 3, so gifts explode with glee. Fireworks for Gaga. Emojis make her happy. As in her face they slappy. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. From a single rose to a whole bouquet. Anything will be okay. If you can, that's okay. Smileys in chat still win the day. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga. Fireworks for Gaga.
Bit Weird has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat. Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga Grumps says anyone need a treasure chest. Gaga Grumps says let's play Wordle. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose?
Thanks for
Predictions
the
in the
follow.
chat now.
Bradley has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. O. Gaga Grumps says thanks for following Bradley. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word.
Wanda Wonder Wordle, says Osher.
Wonder Wonder, Wordle dotted line face has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says hey there Wandle. Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance.
Zombie says Osha.
Gaga Grumps says treasure box up if you need a coin for your daily heart. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with O please PH7.
Mum says overt.
TH7 says ovary.
Gaga Grumps says ovary you got.
Moon says airball.
Gaga Grumps says wipeouts in the chat.
Maxim
MMKH says wipeout.
Machi says winter.
Maxo NMTB has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says shine fits. Macy says winter.
Mum says shine PLS.
Gaga Grumps says winter is 6.
Macy has entered the grotto.
Mochi says winter.
Machi says winter.
Mum says bleed.
KOBITA has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says nearly a double. A yellow E in need of a home. Gaga Grumps says winter is 6. Let's Macy. Gaga Grumps says bleed works.
Nathan has entered the grotto.
Nathan says yes. Gaga Grumps says E lives at number 3. L and D are homeless. Gaga Grumps says hey Nathan.
Mum says dwell.
Gaga Grumps says dwell fits.
Nathan says yes, dwell.
Moo says Wordle in 4.
It's playtime! Gaga is in the box! Don't let her lose! Grumps is on
Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those double names in the chat.
Are you ready to play? Let those stickers fly! Which team are you on? Team Gaga, give a cheer. Team Grumps, are you here? Team Gaga, are you ready? Team Grumps, are you steady? Game! Gremlins, let's go!
We would be honored.
Gaga Grumps says can you do the daily Wordle? I post mine on my page and would love you to share your results. Gaga Grumps says thanks for doing your daily half MMKH.
Nathan says let's go.
Gaga Grumps says if you haven't done it yet, grab your daily heart while I set up the next grid. Gaga Grumps says gimme a sec, Wordle logged me out. Gaga Grumps says let's play our last Wordle of the day. Gaga Grumps says what letter will the wheel choose? Predictions in the chat now.
MMKH says FG.
Gaga Grumps says we are starting with A. M. Gaga Grumps says leaderboard reset incoming. Tap those screens. The one wearing the crown at the end of the song chooses the first word. MMKH says moist.
YB Spiky says to donut.
YB Spiky has entered the grotto.
Gaga Grumps says I've given you the beat, now let's see your fingers dance. Gaga Grumps says thanks for following Spiky. Gaga Grumps says your word starting with M please Chris. Gaga Grumps says men you got.
Says sheep.
Gaga Grumps says a yellow E in need of a new home. Gaga Grumps says sheep fits. Gaga Grumps says added a homeless S.
Mum says close.
Gaga Grumps says close works.
Mum says goose.
Gaga Grumps says S and E live at 4 and 5. O needs a home.
Mum says NVM.
Mum says worse.
Mum says not goose.
Gaga Grumps says goose doesn't fit.
Mum says worse.
Gaga Grumps says worse fits.
Mum says rouse.
Jesse Harding G has entered
Jesse
the grotto.
Harding says rouse.
Bring it on, says mouse.
Gaga Grumps says hey there Jesse.
Mum says rouse GG.
Gaga Grumps says rouse fits. Needs to start with R, bring it on. Gaga Grumps says GG Gremlins. Let's see those W's in the chat. Gaga Grumps says thanks for joining me to play Wordle. I will be back at 4 PM UK tomorrow for more Wordle with Gaga.
Bring it on, says oh now I get it.
Wordle with Gaga. Wordle with Gaga.
Gaga Grumps says there are some Wordle lessons on my page, bring it on.